Good afternoon, everybody. Let's start our roundtable presentation. We have a faculty candidate for computer science department today, Dr. Brian Mix. He has a PhD degree in computer science at BYU, and currently he's a postdoctoral associate at Rutgers University. His main research area for his PhD was computer graphics, and during his postdoc research, he used computer graphics more for data analysis and big data. So I had a dinner with him yesterday, and then we had a very interesting discussion, and you can really see how the big data application in many of your lives. So let's welcome the speaker with the speaker.
Thank you. Thank you all for inviting me here and letting me come talk. Our story today starts with the New York City skyline. This picture was taken from the Brooklyn Queens side in New York. So down here would be the financial district where the Freedom Tower was being built when this picture was taken. We have the Empire State Building and then the Chrysler Building. And it's kind of an ominous picture because of a gathering storm. And the reason I picked this particular photograph is because it was taken just as Sandy was making landfall in New York City, which was a huge deal for the Northeast. I moved to Rutgers a little less than a year after Sandy and had this amazing experience of not having lived through Sandy, but being able to see the devastation that came with this hurricane. Rutgers has a large forest preserve that it maintains right next to where we chose to live. And as I go through this preserve every day, you can see these oak trees that are hundreds of years old that just tipped over so easily, and in the process knocked down several other trees. Just this trail of devastation from the hurricane. And then talking with people, everyone has their Sandy story. Everyone wants to talk about what it was like to go without power, sometimes up to 3 weeks. We want to talk about how that affected work, how they were able to get gas, issues like that. Just to see the wake of this huge storm and what it did for the lives of all these people. But what's most interesting for me about living post-Sandy around New York City is what people feel about the government response. And it's almost all overwhelmingly positive. New Yorkers are really, really proud that they got their subway back in less than a week, which to me still boggles my mind that they could put it together that quickly after everything was submerged. They're really excited about the fact the government got gasoline back quickly. And this meant people could travel, but it also meant for those who didn't get power back for weeks, they could power their generators. All sorts of things came into line to make Sandy, the recovery, work very quickly for most of the population in New Jersey, where I live, and in New York City especially. And part of the reason it worked so well with Sandy was past experiences with other hurricanes, such as Katrina, which didn't turn out so nicely. And a lot of the work that the Homeland Security is doing with big data and using all these different resources, all these different departments within Homeland Security to handle disasters. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is how big data is handling these Homeland Security challenges that the government faces, issues like Sandy that we just talked about. So Homeland Security has a history that goes back a long time. One of my coworkers has a poster with a series of Native Americans with the caption being Homeland Security started in 1492. Things really kicked off in our country after the September 11th attacks. And there are really two things the government realized after the Twin Towers fell down. One was that our country has an acute threat from terrorist organizations. Like, this is really an issue we have to address and take care of. As I was preparing for this presentation, I was reading about it. I didn't realize more people died in the September 11th attacks than died in Pearl Harbor, which to me, a whole army sending in all its aircraft killed less people than just having these two buildings collapse. And it just reinforced to me how big of an event this was for the country and how vulnerable people realized we were. The other thing that came out of the attack was that all these different organizations had known some little piece about what was going on, but it hadn't been communicated effectively and hadn't been able to stop it. And so they came up with this idea of, let's create the Department of Homeland Security, bring all these different organizations together, and have them work together under the same head. So we have DHS. There's countless organizations. Here's a few that you may be more familiar with. The list just goes on and on. They all work under this Department of Homeland Security head. Some of you may be more familiar with the Department of Defense, say through DARPA grants. And one thing I've learned working at Rutgers is that there's also a lot of research funding opportunities that comes through DHS. That's totally separate from DoD. And so I hope one of the takeaways from today is that there may be opportunities for funding for you in somewhere you've never thought of, which is DHS. So as I go through some of the examples, if any of these resonate with you, we can talk about different venues and possibilities there. So I work with a lot of these different organizations at Rutgers, and there's a common theme through all these different organizations when they come with their data and say, what can we do with this? Or we have this data, we think we can solve this problem with it, how are we going to do it? People are really concerned about one of two things. One is this guy, which Wikipedia claims is a member of ISIS. And then that issue over there, natural disaster. People are worried about two things. They're worried about this active intelligent attacker who's choosing his time, he's choosing his location, he's training for something very specific. But they're also very worried about the natural disasters, which if you look over the history of the United States since September 11th, natural disasters have killed more people and caused more damage than terrorist activity. And so organizations are worried about both of these issues. How do we handle the threats that come from these two places? And specifically, at Rutgers, we have a Center of Excellence funded by DHS that focuses on data analytics. What do we do with our data to address both of these problems? So here's a brief outline of what we're going to talk about today. I want to start off and do a couple quick case studies with work I've done with the US Coast Guard. Kind of give you a sense of the breadth of what Homeland Security does, why it's interested in big data, and then drill down into some of the more technical details as I go with my work with stadium security, and then work with crowds, both moving them onto 3D surfaces for multi-story buildings, and then adding social interactions with crowds, and then I'll do some look at kind of the 5-year range of future work that can come out of what we're going to talk about today, and then a brief conclusion. So let's talk about the US Coast Guard. So when the Department of Homeland Security was founded, Congress added a mandate that they work closely with universities through the Science and Technology Directorate. And so Cicada is one of 13 centers of excellence that receives grant funding from the Department of Homeland Security. And it takes that money and diffuses it to, I think the count is 13. It's between 15, 20-ish other organizations. Some of them are industry partners, most of them are other universities, to work on these different problems that come from the government. And then the Department of Homeland Security takes its different organizations and says, here's someone you can talk to when you have data analytics problems. And as the Department of Homeland Security has grown, there's not only this concept of DHS, there's also what they call the Homeland Security Enterprise, which are all of these industries that don't work for the government, but are highly related to Homeland Security issues. So we work with the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which takes care of all the transportation, all the infrastructure for not only New York City, but New York and the surrounding regions in New Jersey. That's part of the Homeland Security Enterprise. They're very interested in leveraging DHS resources such as centers of excellence. And so we get to work with all these different kinds of organizations. So specifically, I want to talk about the Coast Guard to kick things off. The Coast Guard has this massive boat fleet, which I imagined, I had no idea they have an enormous aviation fleet. And that's because if someone's out drowning, they want to get there faster than a boat can take them there. And they're also tasked right now with a lot of responses. Again, going back to our intelligent attacker, natural disaster threat. Natural disasters, someone's drowning because the seas are high. They also have a lot of drug enforcement missions right now. A lot of the drugs coming to the country are seabound. And so they work to interdict those drugs as early as possible, sometimes a long range away from the country in the waters as they come up from South America. So an enormous fleet that's been collecting a lot of data on all these search and rescue missions, all these drug enforcement missions for a really long time. So one of the first things that happened at Cicada was the US Coast Guard said, DHS, we have all this data. We have these small little boats. They're called RBSs. They're response boat smalls. And they're just these tiny little boats that go really quickly. And if you run out of gas, and you're going to die because you're out of gas, this response boat, small, will go out there really quick and fill up your tank and remind you to bring more gas next time. Hundreds and hundreds of events like this happen at each of these Coast Guard stations all year long. Okay? The Coast Guard said, we have hundreds of stations along the coast and Lake Michigan, even on some of the rivers. We have lots of data about where these events happen, but we really distribute these RBSs using our gut. We think this is where they should be. Can you sit down and analyze this data and tell us whether or not our boats are in the right place? Okay, so it's a great data analytics problem we sat down with. And in terms of cost, you see this graph here. The starting bar is what they were doing. The middle bar is if you make some small adjustments, you can improve things. So this was a mixed integer program. But as part of this process, someone tinkered around and said, what happens if we allowed non-integer solutions to the problem? And discovered that you could optimize it even further. So we came back to the US Coast Guard and said, by the way, if you just move a fraction of a boat, you can be even more responsive and work on a smaller budget. So it engaged in this conversation of, what does it mean to have a fraction of a boat? And as we've worked back and forth with the Coast Guard, we actually had a captain from the US Coast Guard in our offices last week. They come down all the time. As we said, what does it mean to have a fraction of a boat? Well, maybe it means that a boat's somewhere for 3/4 of the year or half the year and somewhere else for the rest of the time. And so again, it turns into a big data problem where they give us a lot of data and say, are there trends in seasonality that would support this? Or is everyone needed at the same time so we can't share boats? And the answer is you can. There are different seasonality trends. Colder regions have search and rescue events at different times than places such as Florida. And so we just finished this product, which is the next version of the boat allocation module, where the Coast Guard gives us data about a bunch of different stations that could share boats logistically. And we sit down and say, okay, if we moved a boat from Castle Hill to Cape Cod for those 2 months, it would be much more effective. We'd have the right number of boats at the right time to handle the different seasonality trains. And same one down here, we've got something at Point Judith, but if we moved them down to Woods Hole for this time, it would work better. And this is what the Coast Guard uses to allocate its boats right now. And it's been a great combination of Coast Guard has a lot of data. We've got these resources we can sit down and model Coast Guard boats and their needs and come out with a solution that they've really enjoyed using as they make their decisions. This worked so well that they came back and said, hey, you've modeled one type of boat handling one type of mission for us. What if we expanded the scope to our entire airborne fleet across the entire country? We said, we can take a look at it. They gave us a big chunk of data. And it ends up, this is a far more complicated problem because we're looking at a wide range of different aircraft, including helicopters and airplanes, which have very different capacities and what they can do and what they're strong at and what they're weak at. And instead of just these small search and rescue events that the RBSs did, we were given a wide range of missions that we had to make sure were being fulfilled. Again, it was the same question. We have all these aircraft, we have this enormous fleet, we have them allocated across the country, but we're really just using our gut to put the airplanes and the helicopters. Can we sit down and make sure we're doing things in the right place? So we had regular meetings with the Coast Guard where we would go over their data and we would actually reconstruct a station. So we made a theoretical station where you could enter data and look at what is the distribution of search and rescue events? Do they happen on the weekends more frequently? Start extracting this type of information from the data. And then replay that back through simulation. So we got to the point where we could take a specific station, say something in Cape Cod, take that data, and then run our simulation, and it would be, what would happen at this station if you took away a helicopter or you added an airplane? And what the Coast Guard really wants to know, how they judge their response is, how often during the year does an event come in when we don't have a helicopter that can take off? That's how they judge responsiveness. They want to make sure that at every station, there's always a helicopter or an airplane there who can respond to the event. And we could do these simulations is, after we built the distributions of how these events come in, we could answer questions and say, if you took away a helicopter, instead of only one time a year not being able to respond, you would have 3 times a year when you wouldn't be able to respond. Or if you added an airplane, the response doesn't change. Like, that's not the right thing to do. So once we could model all these stations, we sat down and did an integer programming problem for optimizing across the entire country. Okay, where should we put these extra airplanes? Where should we put the helicopters? And again, this is in US Coast Guard V&V right now. They're going through their verification process before they sit down and use it. And there's some really fun future work with this. They want to expand this to ask questions about what future airplane should we invest in? If we could give you a theoretical airplane or a theoretical helicopter, can you tell us which properties would be most useful for us in terms of using a new airplane? Is something that de-ices quickly going to be more important than something that has an extra 100 miles of range? Those type of, and they're just fascinating questions that suddenly the Coast Guard can start making informed decisions about long-term theoretical investments that they just had no capacity to do beforehand. And so that's just a brief breadth look at something we've done with the US Coast Guard. We work closely with a lot of these other universities I mentioned. We work with CMU. Dr. Ed Hovey does work on helping track how human trafficking is happening in the country. And he works closely with law enforcement, especially having the Super Bowl in New Jersey recently with them. We're starting some projects tracking the Ebola outbreak. People do network analysis on criminal gangs, both within and without the United States. Lots of supply chain disaster questions. There was a rapid grant given by NSF after Sandy, and the conferences have all happened at Rutgers as part of this group. Seeing the type of work people are doing and analyzing what happened and why Sandy worked so well is great. I'm part of the committee that's starting the first maritime cybersecurity symposium ever, as people are beginning to recognize the need for better protection for the cybersecurity within the maritime fleet. Here's a picture of an oil rig that was tilted by a cyber attack. Someone attacked the rig and was able to use the computers on board to tilt the rig, and they almost destroyed it. They recovered it in time for it to be salvaged, but it cost a lot of money. They lost a lot of production out of this oil rig, and it was just a cybersecurity attack on this rig. So lots of these different kind of fascinating questions that are being addressed at the Center of Excellence. So I want to dive a little more technical into some of the things we're doing, looking at venue security. So some of this US Coast Guard things we're doing on very large projects, say a dozen authors on a paper, because they're such big projects. As we drill down here with stadiums, we're getting to fewer and fewer, and then at the end, this will be more of my own primary contributions as we go forward here. So venues are a big deal to the Homeland Security enterprise. You're familiar with a venue like this. They're prime targets for terrorists for a variety of reasons. We're very emotionally tied to sports and sporting venues. An attack at a stadium would hurt, as we saw with the Boston Marathon bomb. They're wonderful targets because you have lots of people who are crowded together. It's a great place if you want to do a lot of damage. And it's also a great target because we don't have airport-style security at our stadiums. We have to be able to get in 100,000 people to an NFL event quickly. And so stadiums have come to DHS and say, hey, we have a lot of data. We have we know when people enter our stadiums for a long range of time. What can we do to increase the venue security? And it also has some natural disaster implications, because if a natural disaster hits while we're at a stadium, we're very interested in evacuation, even if it's just something as a fire or a lightning strike. There's lots of rules about when you have to evacuate if there's lightning within a certain number of miles. So as we work with these venues, security directors recognize we have to be very good at making sure everyone's clean when they walk into the venue. There's no guns, there's no bombs. But they also recognize that in the process of clearing people, we're creating these enormous lines of people waiting to be screened. These big lines that would be great targets for terrorists. If you remember, there was an attack at LAX, and the person who came in didn't attack after the security gate. He started shooting just before the security gate. There's lots of people. No one's checked, and he pulled out a gun and killed a lot of people. The security directors were conscious of this, and the Boston Marathon bomb really emphasized this. This is a non-traditional sporting event that was the target. And so suddenly we have two conflicting goals. The venue wants to make sure the venue is clean, while at the same time we want to make sure that we're not creating these enormous lines where people can be targeted and they're not being checked at all. So just as a quick aside, one of the outcomes of this work is more and more NFL venues, because of what we've done, have a secondary perimeter line. So if you go to an NFL game now, you're more likely to actually walk through two lines. The first one, it's really not a line. There'll just be a security guard who's checking to make sure you're not carrying a large bag. That could be something such as a rice cooker, because they're recognizing this. The other issue that these venue directors wanted out of DHS was we have lots of different options for screening our patrons. Investing in a new type of screening mechanism would probably be safer, but would cost a lot of money. And we don't know, excuse me, how much we need to invest in. How many walkthrough magnetometers do we need to get in 80,000 patrons in time? There's a big sense of what they call the fan experience. They want the patrons to get in without having to wait in line for hours, but they still want to be very secure. So we worked with an NFL venue specifically, and it's being used, the product we created is being used by more venues than just this one, that was using a method they called wanding switch to pat down. So they held these handheld metal detectors. They did a kind of cookie cutter around your body to make sure you weren't carrying something. But if the lines ever got too long, they would switch to a pat down method where you just put the wands down and pat you down. And the theory behind this was the pat downs go much quicker. So if our lines are building up to where they're a threat and we're hurting the fan experience, we'll just hurry up and do pat downs and get people in. Obviously, this is a security flaw. Anyone who's been through and has seen the switch would know, ooh, if I'm going to bring something bad in, I'll wait until pat downs start and bring something in, because it's very hard to find anything when you do a pat down. So we're working with the head of security at this stadium, and he says, I'd like to invest in an all wand solution, so no pat downs. How many wands do I need? How many people do I have to hire? And I would really like to do a walkthrough magnetometer solution, because it's assumed that's more effective. We're doing research on that too right now. But I have to be able to justify it, and I have to know how many of these walkthroughs I need. They're very expensive. How many do I need so I don't ruin the fan experience? So as we work with them, we're like, well, we need some data in order to calculate this. So we get data that looks like this, which is how many tickets are being scanned over time as we head to an NFL game. And it's classic as you look at all this data. It all has the same kind of trend here. There's people who are really excited to get in who wait at the gate until the gates open, and then nobody comes for a while. And then finally we build up until where fans are coming through at maximum capacity. They're scanning as fast as they can. And I can't see the numbers, but I can bet the kickoff is right here, is right where we're peaking. And then once we hit kickoff, it drops off really quickly. So fortunately, the venue we're working with says, we do have this data. We've been collecting this data for a long time. We don't know why we've been collecting it, but now we know we can do something useful with it. Can you take this data, can you create a model that we can use this data with so that we can predict what would happen if we changed our screening procedures? And that's what we did. So first thing we had to do was build a model of how a line evolves over time. So we build this kind of difference equation here where we have the state of the line at any given time. Let's see if we have a laser here, do we? Okay, how many people have arrived? How many people are being screened? And then how big was the line when we started? And of course, when we start off, the line's empty, okay? And as you see, we do some more equations. We have to make sure that we never screen more people than are in the line. Otherwise, you'll have a negative line. And the computer doesn't realize that's bad. But we'll put a little catch in here as we go forward. So the first thing we did was we had to model the current approach being used by this venue, which was the wanding switch to pat down. So we have a conditional statement about how many people are getting screened. So we're trying to replace this screening with specific approaches. So this is wanding plus pat down. We do say, we have a number of lines that are doing wandings. That'll give us a sense of how many people are going through at any given time. And then we minimize that against the length of the queue to make sure we don't go into this negative land where we have negative people in our queue. And we make it a conditional, so after we switch and we start doing the pat downs, the rate is actually the number of pat down lanes times how long it takes to do a pat down. Again, we minimize that so we know how many people are coming through. So what they want to do is take, okay, this is what we're doing. Can we model what would happen if we're just doing wandings? Okay, so the equation is a little bit simpler because it's not conditional anymore. We take the number of lanes we're doing with wanding, how fast it takes to do a wanding, and that's our rate. And then the pie in the sky goal, which is, can we move to a walkthrough magnetometer only approach? Similar type of equation, how many do we need and what's the rate? So we sat down and we were able to create these equations. And then you notice these equations don't depend on the data itself. Then we take the data we receive from the venue and plug it in. And we try and see if we can solve this equation, which is how soon is the line empty after our peak time? We know, since most venues follow this very specific pattern of we've got a lump at the very beginning, it grows and grows and grows until the event starts and then drops off quickly. If we can clear the line after the event starts, then we're comfortable that we've cleared the line completely. The way that the security managers judge the quality of a screening procedure is, can we clear the line within a certain number of minutes after kickoff? Or when we work with the NBA, tip-off time, whatever it is appropriate for the venue. And so this T2, which is the event start time, is really important. How long does it take to clear after that event time? Because we don't want to ruin the fan experience in everything that we're doing. So we build these equations, and then we built a simulation here. You can see all these people lining up to pour into this NFL venue, actually. And the graphs got cut off. I apologize. You can see some arrival rate data here, and then how many people are actually in the venue. And as time progresses, the security director can sit down and watch, and these lines will evolve as more people come in, as they get screened and whatnot. See what would happen as a venue if you had 20 walk-through magnetometer lanes. What would happen if you had 30 wanding-only lanes? And then with this, we can give some generalized data about what would happen if you did change your approach. So in this one, we're looking at, I think we're doing wanding-only, yes, wanding-only screening lanes. If the security director put up 50 wanding-only lanes, there's 3 bars here, and you can't see these 2 bars because it's never better than what you're doing, and it's never even comparably the same. It would be worse. They gave us 2 seasons worth of data for this. In every game, it would have been much worse if you only had 50 wanding lanes. If you push that up to 60 wanding lanes, about half the time, you'd be the same or better than what you're doing before, and about half time, it would be worse. So you've gained this extra security because you're not doing pat downs, but you're hurting the fan experience as you do this. When you start pushing up to 65 and then to 70, we're starting to get some very good performance. We're either outperforming or matching what we were doing before. And the way we judge this is we look at the length of line with 5 minutes after kickoff. Is there a significant line? If there's not, it's the same. And if we clear it even sooner than that, we know we've done very, very well. And it's tools like this that security directors have used to actually change security practices at some NFL venues. It's been a lot of fun to watch the one we work with most closely as they've gone through the evolution of being able to convince their funders that it is worth it, that it is feasible, and increasing the security at their venues. So with that, I want to talk a little bit more about crowd simulation again within this Homeland Security enterprise. And again, as we're pushing into these last couple topics, this is a lot closer to an individual contribution that I want you guys to be aware of. I'm planning on targeting about an hour, right? So about another half an hour to go. Am I doing okay? All right. So crowd simulation's been around for a long time. One of the struggles that crowd simulation has had, not struggles, just assumptions, is that we always want to do crowd simulation on 2D planes. It's very convenient when you do crowd simulation to limit yourself to a 2D plane. The math falls out very easily. But if you want to study an evacuation in a multi-story building, for example, the building we're in, that's not going to cut it. You need to have some sense of multidimensionality. You need that third dimension in there. And so I started on this project where I wanted to ask the question, can we move crowd simulation to multi-story buildings? And can we generalize it enough that we can put it on any type of surface in the world? So I come from somewhat of a graphics background. So I'm interested in, there's lots of video games that break lots of assumptions about gravity. There's been a series of movies, Inception being a classic example, where we have crowds moving on non-planar surfaces. Okay, and we've got a nice little Moebius strip with 1,000 people walking on it in the background. Can we find equations and methods that are generalizable enough that for this very specific application they work well, but they also work well across a wide range of surfaces with any sort of topology, even down to a Moebius strip there. So there's a long history here. And there's really 2 components when you do crowd simulation. The first step is you want to model the path that agents will take as they move across the surface. So if I'm going to leave this building, I have a mental image. Oh, I'm going to go downstairs. I'm going to take the stairs and leave. Kind of a vague idea, but I know the guideposts I'm going to follow on the way out. After I do that, path planning, as I move around, I'm going to start doing obstacle avoidance, which is, oh, there's someone in my way. I'm going to move laterally, or I'm going to pause. Or there's someone I want to talk to, maybe I should stop and talk to that person. Lots of people have done work in path planning, and it works really great in 2D, and people have done great obstacle avoidance that works in 2D as well. One of the things I wanted to leverage with this project was this obstacle avoidance works very, very well in 2D. I don't want to have to reinvent the wheel to do obstacle avoidance in 3D. Can we build some equations where we can still do the obstacle avoidance in 2D and leverage this very mature research, but still have us on 3D surfaces. Part of the motivation for this is when I'm walking, say in this room, locally, I'm doing 2D obstacle avoidance. I don't need to reinvent something for this room. But path planning, I am definitely in a 3D environment. And it ends up moving to 3D does change some things in obstacle avoidance. We'll discuss in a minute. So one of the contributions of this work was defining precisely the difference between a good and a bad path planning algorithm. Because when we're moving to 3D, we want to make sure that we're doing this right. Some easy things is we want to make sure that our path doesn't go through an obstacle. We're not going to be walking through walls. On 3D, you start having interesting cases where if an ant is on a branch and he's trying to get the opposite side of the branch, my path has to be on the surface. It just can't be a direction. Otherwise, he'll get stuck in this local minima right here. A similar example when I'm in a 2-story building. If my path doesn't follow the surface, I'll get a local minima if I'm going to a different floor. And then this is the big deal. If my paths are linear, it's very easy for me to get in a jam. So the shortest path, this is a staircase leading up onto another floor, for both of these agents going in opposite directions, is on the very, very inside of the stairwell. So if they're following their paths, they're going to run in front of each other and they're going to stop because there's nowhere they can move that's taking them farther away from the next waypoint, and we get a jam. And everybody's going to walk up and down the staircase is going to jam after that jam happens. And we create this massive jam that visually is very obvious and makes it so our crowd simulation is no longer meaningful in terms of predicting what would happen in the evacuation. So with this criteria, we started building, I guess it was me, I started building some equations for path planning. So what we have to do is take an agent. We know where an agent's position is, and we know where its destination is. And when we move to 3D, we have to take into account the mesh itself and its topology. So in these examples, we run from small meshes all the way up to 100,000 meshes, meshes with 100,000 triangles. So they can be very complicated. And then what we want is a list of waypoints that represent how I'm going to get from where I am to where I'm going. It ends up that we have to improve this waypoint list. We can generate this using any sort of classic path planning algorithm, Dijkstra's A*. But out of the box, it's not going to work. Okay, we gave the example of jamming around stairs. We have to be able to take each of these individual waypoints and account for the fact we're on a 3D surface and account for the fact there's going to be other people walking around. So what we do is we take this list and we expand what we get out of our path planner to have some improved points. And then we not only generate points, is we analyze the geometry and take these points and expand them into lines. We have a bunch of lines that run perpendicular to my path. So I kind of have gates I'm walking through, not just points on the floor. I give myself the lateral leeway that I need to get to my destination while passing other people going in the opposite direction. So here's an example of what this looks like, some of the geometric processing that has to happen. So we've got someone who's going to be walking up this staircase. If I hand this to A* or Dijkstra's, I might get a path that looks like this. And Dijkstra's comes back and says, I'm very happy. I found exactly the shortest path for you. Why aren't you happy? Well, I'm not happy for a lot of reasons. First of all, we're following the different vertices of this mesh, where when you walk around, you don't think of the land as triangles as you're going through in path planning. We also have the problem that I'm going to be walking with my shoulder on the wall, which usually doesn't happen in real life. There's a little bit of leeway there. And we're going to have the jamming problem. It's inevitable if we have 1,000 people walking on the surface. So the first thing I introduce is this line of sight concept, where I can go over the geometry and analyze it. And as I watch how the normal changes over time, I can figure out the next waypoint that I can't see and get rid of this waypoint that isn't helping me at all. And in fact, it's making my path worse. After we do that, we can do the geometric processing where we actually improve the path by pushing away from these edges. So your path is going to be composed of vertices, and each of these vertices is attached to line segments, and these line segments create triangles. So what I do is, if I can identify which points are on edges, and I can identify which points connect to these vertices, I can follow these line segments and push away from the edge, because I know the line segments will lead me away. And I go from having, say, 2 or 3 points to maybe having 10 here, because each vertex is going to have multiple lines. In fact, it's guaranteed. So my number of waypoints will grow, and as I slide away, suddenly I'm getting some latitude. I'm not quite as close to the wall. And then with that, if I keep following those lines, I can expand my vertex points into actual lines. And suddenly I have a corridor, not just a line that I'm following in 3D. And with that, I can get rid of the jams that are caused because there's more than one person on my scene. And cross your fingers. The next slide is amazing, I promise. And it's a video, and that's why it's taking a while to load. This is a 15-story building where we have, I think we have 1,000 agents on this 15-story building. It shows you what these results look like. If we can get it to play. I promise it's amazing. You also get a sense there we have, what I'm going to talk about next, which is some socialization happening, which is why you have little word bubbles. So people are going to be walking around on this multi-story building. It's 15 stories high. They're not going to be getting stuck in the local minima that you would expect. And the key point here is right where that staircase edges, that's where people would jam if you weren't accounting for the geometry appropriately, pushing away from these edges and giving some lateral width to the edges. I should have included a what it looks like if you don't do it right slide. And it's right there in those corners where people get lost and create these jams that grow exponentially. And then to demonstrate that these equations work on generalized surfaces, this next video after it loads is an example of agents walking around on a globe. Okay? This is a really interesting problem because there's no way to map 2D onto a globe without adding all sorts of edge cases. So the fact that we can walk around on this highly tessellated sphere, especially on the poles, which unfortunately I cut off, where the triangles are minuscule as you approach the pole without falling through, is very, very good. So another problem with crowd simulation on 3D surfaces is we violate all sorts of our assumptions about visibility and obstacle avoidance. So this is a classic example, maybe not classic, I think this is a fun example, kind of a science fiction scenario. What happens if people are walking on the ceiling? Well, suddenly I'm breaking some assumptions about obstacle avoidance. The people down here don't want to bump heads with people up there, but the distance on the surface between them is enormous. So if I take the classic what's my surface distance approach, we're going to walk through each other because we think we're not going to run into each other. And so what I did is I sat down and formalized what is happening on the obstacle avoidance side in 2D. How do we make the appropriate reconstruction into 3D to make this work? So it's going to work on any surface, whether that's a multi-story building or that science fiction scenario that I gave you right there. What happens when we're doing obstacle avoidance in 2D is we're trying to define a function. We take a set of obstacles that are defined in 2 dimensions and an agent. And from there, we want to know how the agent should change its bearing and its velocity. Okay? This is what's happening maybe just below your conscious as you're walking down a crowded hall, is you're changing how you're rotated and your speed to make sure you don't run into someone who's walking towards you or who's moving slower than you are. Well, we don't look at every single obstacle in the universe when we're making our plan. So all of previous work has this implicit concept of what's relevant to me. So given an agent and every obstacle in the universe, I want to have a function that will produce relevant obstacles that are a subset of all the obstacles. What am I actually using right now to do obstacle avoidance? So when you leave the room today, you'll be avoiding all the other people in this room and the walls and the door, but you won't be thinking about the people on the floor below you as you're making those fine decisions about how to change your speed and bearing. And then we put all this together to say, I have relevant objects that are a certain distance and angle away from me. I have the agent. How do I change my bearing and velocity? We want to take this and we want to move it to 3D. But when you move to 3D, if you don't adjust it, it's going to break in one of 3 cases. The first case is the one I just showed you, the science fiction example. I have 2 people who are very, very close, but their surface distance is very, very high. So they're not going to realize they're going to run into each other. We're going to get some awkward head bumping going on. Probably more applied with a Homeland Security concern is this one. If I don't look at surface distance, but just our distance through space, so classic Euclidean distance, I'm going to start avoiding people who are on a different floor than I'm on. Okay? That's both visually very obvious and disturbing when you watch it, and it's not going to help us if we want to simulate a real evacuation. And then if you go into another domain, something a little more entomological, if we have ants on a branch, if we just take their distance, it's going to be very small as they walk across the thin branch, but they shouldn't be avoiding each other. So I sat down and retooled all of these equations for 3D. And we have an agent and a set of obstacles. Now they're in 3D, plus we have the mesh itself, and I want to know how I'm going to change my bearing and my velocity. You'll notice that what we're trying to do is the same. We're changing our bearing and velocity. That's 2 dimensions, even though we're still in 3D. It's because I'm always walking on a 2-dimensional surface when I move around. So again, in 2D, we have this concept of a relevant function. And then once I know what's relevant, I can decide how to change what I'm doing. And I include this slide because in all this work, the real answer was in deciding how to cull what is relevant and what is irrelevant in 3D. It ended up that was where the change needed to be done. Some people have tried to address this problem in 3D by looking at this function here. It ends up that if you take a step back and decide what's relevant and irrelevant, that's where you're going to make a difference. So we're in 3D. We want to do our obstacle avoidance in 2D, so we need to do some projection. Okay, people are not going to be exactly on the same plane as you are. So if you do a series of cross products, you can project other agents down onto the same plane as you. And then if you do an inverse tangent on that, you can figure out. So we're going to take the inverse tangent of my agent's forward vector and my agent's right vector. So I'm trying to put everything in the agent's coordinate system, so it's relative to where the agent's walking. Then we take this projection of other possible obstacles. We can figure out on this projected surface, what is the angle from me to the obstacle I'm trying to avoid. And then, once we have the angle, we also need to know the distance, and we can figure out the offset. And one of the contributions of this work is, in 2 dimensions, you only need one simple geometry to define each agent. Usually it's a circle that encompasses, say, your stride width as you walk. So say a half-meter radius. You can't just have a sphere in 3D. Spheres don't capture our collision geometry very well. You actually have to start summing geometries when you move to 3D. And I found that 3 spheres stacked on top of each other starts to give you that accuracy that you need. If you just do one sphere at your feet, people are going to be banging heads, like in the science fiction example. But we don't want very complicated geometry because that takes a lot of time to process. So what we do is we use spheres in 3D, we sum them together to give you 3 different offsets to the obstacle that you've just projected down. Here we go. It ends up that the optimal way to do relevancy is to just do synthetic vision for each agent and figure out what they can see or what they can't see. So you could just have a little viewpoint and render out onto your GPU what they can see, analyze those pixels, figure out which obstacles I can see, and throw that into my set of relevant obstacles. People have done this in 2 dimensions, and it works well. The problem is in 3D, we're starting to run into some processing problems. In 2D, people are walking around on a plane that's usually defined by 2 triangles. Okay, you start adding walls, those are 2 triangles each. We're walking around on a surface that's composed of 100,000 triangles. We're not going to be able to render out to the GPU 1,000 different viewpoints 30 times per second, send them back to the CPU to be analyzed. We're just not going to have that type of traction. We don't have that type of bandwidth. The solution came in a series of dot products, and it works out quite nicely because we know something about all of our agents. We know everyone's feet are on the floor. So if I have a list of all the agents in my scene and their position, I can throw away the mesh because I know everyone is walking on a surface that is at least approximately flat at their feet. What I can do is I can do a series of visibility tests between the agent who's trying to avoid and people that may or may not be relevant to him. And it's like I'm doing a raycast, which would be computationally expensive. But since I'm using these disks that people are walking on that are strides width in size, it ends up the math is very, very simple, and then just being a couple dot products. And I check to make sure that in order to see you, I don't see through the ground you're walking on. In order to see you, I don't have to look through the ground I'm walking on. And if I violate either of those conditions, I can throw you out as irrelevant. And so what we see here is a 2-story building where we're not doing this. And we do this cutaway. 2 agents are going to very slowly, they avoided each other when they shouldn't have. That's what you just saw, believe me. Okay. If you do this processing that I've just described, as they walk towards each other, they're going to totally ignore each other the entire time, which is what happens in real life. Okay. Suddenly we're moving people on 3D structures appropriately. I apologize that it's so slow. I'll have to figure out why. And here's another example. Here's our science fiction example showing that we can have people very far away on the surface who will avoid each other correctly because they're taking a Euclidean distance, but then doing these following checks to make sure that everything's aligned correctly so they don't run into each other. So this is the opposite problem. They should be avoiding each other, and you notice that they are avoiding each other properly as they walk through this. So I was going to get some field data to demonstrate this is exactly what it looks like in real life, but it didn't quite work out. A big question, I'll talk about this in future work, is how do you validate your crowd simulation algorithm quantifiably? And so one way to do this is to look at the presence of stalling within a crowd. Stalling means an agent has stopped moving but hasn't reached its destination. It's always invariably a result of a poor crowd simulation algorithm where agents have gotten stuck. I'll give you an example of going around a corner with the stairs. That's when people start to jam. And so if I look at my crowd simulation and wait to see, do people jam? I get a sense of whether or not this is working. So you see here's a blue line that grows, showing lots of jamming as time passes. And this is what happens if you just use a classic two-dimensional algorithm in 3D. People start jamming very quickly. These jams make it harder for other people to get around. So these jams grow exponentially. If you let this run long enough, this curve will continue until it tops out with everyone is jammed. Okay. If we just add the line of sight method that I talked about, we're improving on whatever Dijkstra's or A-star is giving us. The amount of jamming decreases, but you see, we still got this exponential growth. We can't use this for simulation of a building and evacuation. If we start to do the away from edges approach, so we're doing the geometric processing, we're pushing these vertices away from the edges, but we don't give them width, it performs a lot better. But about 60 seconds into the simulation, we get just one jam, and that one jam makes it so much harder for everyone else. And again, we start getting this exponential growth, and I should have continued this graph. It will do the same exponential problem that we've had before. When we put everything together and we give our agents width, we get a nice flat line. If there's any confusion, it gets resolved very quickly, and we don't have a jam that lasts, and so people don't get stuck. So this is the quantitative analysis. There's other methods that people have used for a long time, such as people aren't running into each other, collision avoidance. And again, with this method, we get those same properties of people don't walk through each other. Yes?
When you say corridors, do you mean sort of logical paths forward? Or?
At the time I made this graph, corridors was the name I used for adding width to your path that ran perpendicular to the waypoints you're walking between. So there's that concept of width. So let me explain that a little better. You don't own this territory. So when I have a waypoint, say I've done A-star, and it says the next point you need to get to is on the inside corner of that door, I'm trying to walk to that point. When I give myself width, instead of having that point, I'll have a line that extends out and says, I don't care where on that line I hit, so I'll go any one of those places. So if someone's coming towards me and I'm pulling my obstacle avoidance algorithm, saying, if I go this way, is it just as good? If I give myself a line, it will say, yes, it's just as good. You're going to get to your destination in the same amount of time. So I don't claim any space, but I have a corridor of places I can go to without penalty. That's a great question. So, and another great way to validate your crowd simulation is at speed. We're running at 40 frames a second on 30 surfaces with 1,000 agents, several of which have over 100,000 triangles, which we're really starting to push what you would use to define a building with that many triangles. Some of the follow-on work with this is looking at social crowd simulation. Crowd simulation has done a very good job of having crowds that just ignore everyone and treat them like they're walking pillars. If you want to simulate something like a venue, the majority of people actually come in as social groups. I sat down and done the calculations of some of these venues. People are social. It ends up talking with one of these security directors about an evacuation. People will ignore evacuation instructions until they've met up with the group they walked in with before they leave. If we're not modeling these social interactions, we're not going to capture a correct evacuation. And running out of time, so I'm going to move through these quickly. The contribution with this was redefining the rewards people feel as they walk. So as we talked about going to the door, before the reward was, how quickly am I getting to the door? What we introduced with this is, I'm going to give you a social reward that may be worth more than getting to where you're going. So I see a friend who's in the hall walking the opposite direction. I'll stop and talk. It's not helping me get to my destination, but I'm gaining a reward, a social reward. In order to get this, I turned to an area called Transactional Analysis. It's an area in psychology that tries and defines why we stop and talk to people, and especially how long do we talk to people? What motivates the time over multiple interactions? It ends up we have longer conversations when we are better friends, and then we have high interest in the conversation, meaning we haven't talked recently. So what I did is I sat down and defined a series of equations here that will capture what the psychological literature has talked about at kind of a high level and lets us recreate this in a real simulation. It says, my interest in talking, agent A's interest in talking to agent B will grow if we're not near each other at all. It will decrease if we're close to each other and we're not socializing. This is a critical component of the math. If I'm sitting and talking to you, we're friends, we're chatting. Okay, hi, how you doing? And a friend of mine walks by, there's gonna be some nonverbal interaction, maybe a nod or whatnot. If you don't capture that, what will happen is when I'm no longer interested in you, I'll see my friend, oh, I'm interested in you. And as you start to walk away, I'm no longer interested in my friend and I'll be interested in you. And we create this terrible thrashing that doesn't happen in real life. Wasn't that a great conversation? I'm no longer interested in you. Goodbye. Well, we can build a series of equations like this. And what happens is we can model the interest agent A has and agent B in the scenario. He comes into work in the morning. He's really interested. They talk. That's what this blue box is. The interest drops. Once the conversation's over, their interest in talking really drops. It's going to be awkward. A while later, they meet at the water fountain. They chat for just a minute because the interest is so low. When they meet at the copy machine a little bit later, just maybe some nonverbal communication. But when they go home at night, they chat on the way out in the hall. That's exactly how it's defined in transactional analysis literature. And this is actually, it's pulled from my simulation as how this interest evolves. We're capturing that appropriately. I'm going to skip over the social nucleus, which defines how we walk together when we're going to the same point. Just move on to this video. By controlling everyone's interest at the same time, we can recreate an evacuation. You're socializing, that obnoxious red box goes off, we stop talking, we head to the nearest exit. And as soon as it goes off, we're very interested in talking because we want to share this wonderful experience we just had. We can capture this in a custom way. So if you're a security director and I'm modeling a venue, I can just push a button that says, okay, everyone's interest in talking drops, they're going to evacuate. Suddenly I've got an evacuation going out. So let's talk about future work in a remaining couple minutes. Where this is headed, where this concept of data, working with a Homeland Security enterprise, what does this mean in future research? Some of you may be stuck in lines like this on the day after, well, actually Thanksgiving night now. Black Friday lines. We're working with the largest bus terminal in the world right now. And the thing they say that's missing in crowd simulation literature is the formation of lines. We're great at getting to where we're going. We suddenly have social dynamics. Part of a social dynamic is that we queue. They want to be able to recreate these lines. Lines move. When they hit a wall, they make decisions about which way do they go. They break and then reform when people walk through them. There's all sorts of interesting dynamics. In a large bus terminal, the formation of these lines totally affects the flow of everyone else through the terminal. We're gathering lots of data about this, which is why crowd simulation is turning into a big data problem. We can have hours and hours and hours and days of film. That's a big data problem. We have to sit down, we have to find the people within the data, figure out what the trajectories are, watch a line. How's the curve? Why did these people decide to go this way and not that way when they hit the concrete? Well, there's a reason. There's patterns in why people do this, and we're trying to elicit those. I've got some early theories on that, but we're trying to chunk through this data and answer these questions. One of the big questions about security screening is how effective is wanding? How effective is a walkthrough magnetometer? Okay, we've got these two options. One's a lot more expensive. People assume the walkthrough is more effective. A couple weeks ago, I spent an afternoon just walking through a magnetometer with a fake gun on at an NFL venue, trying to see how effective it was at catching this fake object. So it looked like a gun, but it wasn't a real one. What I'm working on right now is a data problem. Can I give a wander who's just been trained an iPhone or an Android and have them wand with the phone and track the movement of that phone and say, you did really good, but you may have missed this part of the body right there. It gives a sense of training, the effectiveness of training to these venues when they train these temporary workers who come in to work at a game. And it also has the potential to give someone who's wanding feedback to say, oh, that was great, but you just missed their left arm or the bottom of the left arm. Let's go back and do that. It's another project we're working on with these venues. Homeland Security is really interested in that one. We talked about methods of quantifying crowds. We have lots of this data now. We have lots of film. I want to sit down with this film and create better metrics for analyzing crowds, especially in a social situation. What defines accurate crowd simulation in a social environment? And I'm excited there's some good supercomputing resources here. That's what you need if you're going to process that type of film, to do that type of data analysis. And then an optimization problem. We talked about the US Coast Guard optimizing its fleet. This bus terminal we're working with says, if you can give me a crowd simulation, can you tell me how to configure my bus terminal? What's the best way in terms of evacuation? What's the best arrangement in terms of getting people to the terminals quickly? And a fascinating one, they're really interested in retail space. Can I optimize the value of my retail space so I can charge the most rent? Fascinating little questions. I had an REU student over the summer. He was actually just finished his freshman year. We were analyzing film from the Bradford City English fire where a stadium caught fire and about 50 people died. Analyzing this data, we discovered that all the assumptions of the previous literature were wrong because they assume that people run when they see a fire. They go the opposite direction. If you watch the Bradford City fire, almost everyone stops, sees the fire, and actually walked towards it. As this big crush of people came out of curiosity to see the fire expanded faster than they realized, and that's why people died. And so with this RU, we changed the formulas for how people behave in a fire to account for some of these issues. And you can tell it's still very formative, his work that he finished last summer. But it's going to be far more realistic and meaningful when we can capture what really happens in a real fire scenario. So just in conclusion, this has been published in a variety of locations. I have 3 of these journal publications about the crowd simulation. A series of conference papers have to do with both the crowd simulation work and the work with the US Coast Guard. And then we're in the throes of some more work, both with the venues and for the Coast Guard as well. I have a CV if anyone wants to look at the full details on that. I want to conclude with a couple takeaways. First is if you're a student, there may be some opportunities in the Homeland Security enterprise that you hadn't considered in terms of a career. This is a growing area that the government's very interested in. There's this growing enterprise that's trying to protect people from these threats, both the man-made threats and the natural disasters. And again, this may be a great place for some funding. Data analytics is an effective way to handle some of these challenges. That's one thing Sandy taught us. People have been doing this data analytics. It prepared them for Sandy. The response was very, very good. And then we've talked about 2 specific applications. One is in terms of making security decisions, how do we screen our patrons? And then how do we model the flow of crowds? So that's the end, and I'll take questions. Yes, can you tell me your name?
Victor Winter.
How are you doing, Victor?
I've noticed like with the line forming, that there's different parts of the country. The scenario for me is you're driving down the freeway or down the street and one of the lanes is blocked.
Okay.
In some parts of the country, as soon as the people see that this is happening, they make an effort to merge, which of course frees up this lane. And in some parts of the country, that's where it stays, that's where it stabilizes, it's sort of this effort with it. And in other parts of the country, the moment this lane frees, somebody said, I can take a shortcut and go all the way to the front and cut in. And then that's
You mean people do that?
but it is very noticeable in different parts of the country.
Really?
Cultural norms.
What do people in Nebraska do?
They're pretty good.
Are they pretty good? I can tell you people in New Jersey are not good.
Yeah, not like in Chicago, not so good, right?
I believe you.
Crowd density kind of thing, or people are too rushed or stressed out or something. But what I've noticed is very noticeable. You go to different parts of it. You consider any of that kind of. I mean, it seems like that would be sort of an interesting thing to take into account if you're trying to understand what's the.
What I already have built in to the social crowds is being able to tweak very easily people's interest in socializing, which captures not only different regions of the country, but different events. So there's going to be a lot of socializing here when we're done. People are going to chat on their way out, while during the day, maybe not so much in the hall because people are working. One thing I want to do with this, as we're gathering all this film, is starting to try and quantify those differences in different places. So I go to NFL venues, I go to NBA venues, other venues. Even between sports, people's behaviors are very different. I went to an NFL game and an NBA venue on the same day, and that NFL crowd, most people who came in were already intoxicated, while the people who came to the NBA, family friendly, it looked like everyone and had a water before, and that was it. Just a different sport.
And one more thing,
Yeah.
speaking of sport, in events like music events, with the performance, for
Yes.
example, in Germany, when they clap, very common for all of the cloud to sync up. The entire
Really?
cloud will sync
Oh, that'd be
up.
fun. Okay.
And it does not happen. I've never seen it happen in the United States, and it almost always happens. I haven't been that in country, but they almost always sync up, especially for the encore. Everybody syncs up.
Really?
It's going to go the same. Queuing in Japan.
Okay.
It's very different.
Mhm.
Straight line.
Okay.
Vital line.
Okay. So there's a strong cultural sense of the right way to line up, and it's different. Oh, that's fun.
To add to Victor's comment,
Mhm.
another scenario like that would be if you were a visitor to the UK and you're walking down the sidewalk in London. I mean, you're naturally going to walk on the side.
Uh-huh.
Walk to the right, no, you walk to the left.
Oh, so even the cultural way that you avoid. I've got a great story about almost being run over by a black taxi because I looked the wrong way when I went to London. The very first moment I stepped out. That's fantastic. No, I didn't. And they're right there, actually, reminding you to look the other way. Those are some great comments. So I think this is really an interesting area within graphics and big data, is because there's all these different subtle variations where finding the right answer for everything is going to be hard. But with some of this work I've done, I found some ideas that generalize, and I want to keep doing that. So people in China don't walk with their shoulder on the wall, and in Australia the same thing. Okay, that's a generalizable result. But socializing, we're starting to get, like, we're picking up these fine things. And I hope I can boil it down to just a few variables that will express it very well instead of having to have a whole different algorithm. That's my goal. Yes?
I wonder if the point at which kind of chaos theory kicks in if you look at crowd dynamics under sort of normal stable conditions, and then you add stress, whether it's in the form of a crowd or heat or whatever, and the dynamic starts to change, and then the point at which just panic breaks out, you're probably in a completely different scenario with that.
Absolutely. So because there's these emergent effects that happen within a crowd, it's totally decentralized. One way that you actually quantify or you judge the quality of a crowd simulation is whether or not these global emergent features are produced. So you gave the example of slowly adding stress. If you have people walking in a hall and you slowly increase the number of people, lanes will spontaneously form. Okay? And if two oncoming crowds hit each other, they'll create a well-defined swirl and go through. So part of the way that I could validate my work on 3D was on a sphere, we're getting that lane formation, we're getting that swirl that we expect to see in 2D. But in terms of future work, precisely defining that is hard. So when I submit these papers to journals, I send a video that says, hey, watch and behold that it's pretty good. But it's hard to put on a graph that says, look, the line formed at the right time. I'd like to be able to do that so you can judge things better. But that's great. That's a great comment. Yes?
How large of a building are you able to simulate? Say the whole trade back in
Uh-huh.
2001.
Mhm.
You're talking about 1,000 people. It's more like 50,000 people in World Trade Centers.
Yeah.
That's actually why, to me, it's kind of amazing that as few people died as did because of the amount of people that are actually in these buildings. But so I'm just curious.
So this project, we're hopefully just days away from getting a grant from this bus terminal we're working with that we started this work on. All the work I've shown you here is done in real time on a workstation. In order to simulate this bus terminal, which has 250,000 people who walk through it every day, it's going to be a distributed solution where we can have a large model and simulate everyone going through, but it's going to require a whole cluster in order to do that. And so this work doesn't do that. We're in the process of building that machinery to handle. Exactly. Trying to chunk it out where these are mostly independent working, whether that's by floor or subfloor. But yeah, once you break that 1,000 agent limit, you need more than one computer. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes?
A couple of your examples of Coast Guard receiving, seems to me that those techniques used to be called operations research. Is there a merging of fields, or has operations research become data analytics, or what? How do you?
That is an absolutely wonderful question because it leads into something I should have said before. The Cicada Center at Rutgers is not a computer science research center. It's an interdisciplinary center. And on the work with the Coast Guard, bingo, the majority of the people were operation researchers. So the majority of the teams were OR folks, okay? In most of these projects I've worked on, I've been the only computer scientist, and it's been an absolute blast. If you want to feel smart, work with people who aren't computer scientists and do something, they'll be like, you can do that? It's like, yes, you can. And then they do something amazing, and to me, it just blows me away. So especially those early projects I showed you, there's all very collaborative, with the majority of the people working on it being from an aura background. So you nailed that on the head. Yes. Yes.
Are all the agent systems to be the same, or can you customize for agents are maybe very, very old, or just their walking speed in general?
So you can customize all of those, and people have looked at the walking speed problem as its own research question. What I personalize with the social crowds is your interest in socializing and who you're interested in socializing. It ends up, the best way to do the who you're interested in was to define everyone on a circle. So you get an angle that defines who you're interested in. So if I say, I'm here on the angle, I'm going to talk to everyone who's within a certain distance of me on the circle, which means all relationships are reflexive but not transitive, which is what happens in real life. So for the social crowds, that ended up being a nice way. It's 2 dimensions: how interested am I in socializing, and who are my friends doing that on a circle. That's great. Yeah.
Along this question, are
Mhm.
you familiar with Adrian Bijan?
I'm not.
Engineer, and he studied fluid dynamics.
Okay.
And basically, he found these same scenarios, but people follow the same things as HVAC systems. When they hit a wall, they go this way. So he's actually developed criteria on how people have evolved their cities, and how they walk. Their airports are all so that you can take the escalator at the same time as you can walk it. You know, so I would look into his stuff. Another thing, if you looked into stigmergic systems where ants, bugs, they are social animals and they interact with the same thing. Somebody's going to come in and spray an ant farm. They first ways of flow.
That's fascinating. I like your first comment. There's been some more recent work into trying to define crowd simulation as a fluid, exactly what we're talking about. Instead of thinking of agents as individuals, think of it's just a mass of fluid that's working through. There's a really good paper at SIGGRAPH about 5 years ago that did that. And it ends up that this approach works very well with crowds that are the right density. So if you have crowds that are moving in a fluid-like environment, where their movement is very much like a fluid, it's an exceptional way to do crowds very quickly. The minute you start changing the density of the crowds, it struggles. So if it's not a dense situation, you lose some reality if it's very dense. But I think some of the really good future work in crowd simulation will come with this fluid concept and figure out how to move to these other 2 states. And this has been a pie in the sky day I've never been able to tackle, but I'd love to look at crowds as 3 states: gas, liquid, and fluid, solid, as the 3 major transitions, and see if you could map real crowds to those 3 things and expand on this idea of fluid crowds, but be able to handle these very dense situations where it's more solid-like and the really open situations where it's more gaseous. So I think next 5-10 years, there's going to be some good research expanding on that idea. Absolutely.
You mentioned early in the presentation, not long after 9/11, the reality of what reality was different agencies had different pictures of the same disparate overall.
Yeah.
And I went to a conference, and fast forward to 2009, this was a Department of Defense Intelligence Information System conference building. And I happened to go to a workshop, a panel discussion, and it was chief information officers of NSA, CIA.
Oh, wow. Okay, yeah.
CIA. I mean, and they have a panel right here, and it's quite a distinguished panel. And the common thing, quite simply, was we're horrible at sharing information. In fact, what you said, post 9/11. This is the 2009. Fast forward to today. Your opinion, I know this is off track with the crux of your presentation, but is it better? Collaboration? And I know that, like the gentleman said here, certain methods, I mean, there seems to be collaboration, but how about just that sharing of data, try to keep this? bigger total picture versus the disparate parts and the potential of having the full picture. Is collaboration on the upswing or?
So I was at a big meeting about 3 months ago when Rutgers introduced a larger system-wide focus on Homeland Security. And the keynote speaker was the first Secretary of Homeland Security. And he spoke at that event. And he touched on exactly what you're talking about. He said, this is one of the big drivers of why we started this department. And he said, in his opinion, it's improved, but there's still a long way to go. And so I can't speak personally to the whole thing, but he certainly echoed that concern. What I think is working well, though, is agencies like the US Coast Guard are giving academics data to solve these problems. I don't think they would have 10 years ago. I think at least on that part that I'm touching, people are getting more and more open with sharing data with people who can solve their problems. So I think there may still be a global issue, but I think in terms of academia, I think it's improving.